The morning sun cast long shadows across the Riverside Police Training Academy as 53-year-old Margaret Chun adjusted her regulation uniform for the third time. The fabric felt strange against her skin, not because it was new, but because she hadn't worn one in 12 years. Her graying hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, making her look more like a substitute teacher than a police recruit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Are you sure you're in the right place, ma'am? The question came from Officer Jake Mitchell, barely 25, his buzz cut still showing razor lines from yesterday's barber visit. He was processing intake forms at the front desk, his tone polite but tinged with confusion. Senior citizen ride-alongs are usually scheduled for Thursdays. Margaret smiled patiently and handed him her paperwork. Margaret Chin, Recruit Class 2024B. Mitchell's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. Behind him, 3 other young recruits had stopped their conversation to watch the exchange. Tyler Brennan, a former college football player whose shoulders strained against his uniform shirt, nudged his friend Marcus Rodriguez with his elbow. "No way they're letting Grandma join the academy," Tyler whispered, loud enough for Margaret to hear. "What's next, bringing our kids to take your daughter to work day?" Marcus snorted. "Maybe she's confused about the Citizens Police Academy. That's the one where they teach you to lock your car doors and call 911. The third recruit, Sarah Coleman, fresh out of the Marines with a confidence that radiated from her posture, shook her head. "This has to be some kind of mistake. The physical requirements alone would eliminate someone her age in the first week." Margaret continued filling out her forms, her pen moving with steady precision. She'd heard it all before, though never quite so directly. The surprised looks, the whispered comments, the assumption that she was lost or confused. It came with the territory when you were starting over at 50-3. Officer Mitchell cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Chun, I need to ask, are you sure you meet the physical requirements? The academy is pretty demanding, and we've had younger recruits wash out in the first month." "I understand the requirements," Margaret replied calmly, not looking up from her paperwork. "Height, weight, vision, hearing, cardiovascular fitness. I passed all the preliminary assessments or I wouldn't be here." Tyler leaned against the desk, his voice dripping with condescension. "Lady, no offense, but this isn't mall security. We're training to chase down armed suspects, wrestle people to the ground, and respond to life or death situations. Maybe you should consider something more age appropriate." Margaret finally looked up, meeting his gaze steadily. For just a moment, something flickered behind her gentle brown eyes, something that made Tyler take an involuntary step backward. But then she smiled again, the same patient smile she'd worn since arriving. "I appreciate your concern," she said simply. Intake process continued around them. Young recruits filled out forms, compared their previous experience, military service, college degrees, security jobs. When they asked Margaret about her background, she wrote "retired" in the employment section and left the experience portion notably sparse. "What did you retire from?" Sarah asked, her curiosity overriding her skepticism. "Office work, mostly," Margaret replied, capping her pen. Marcus laughed. "Office work to police work? That's quite a career change. What did you watch too many cop shows and think it looked easy?" The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their training instructor, Sergeant Patricia Wells, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s whose reputation for breaking cocky recruits was legendary throughout the academy. Her steel-gray hair was cropped short, and her eyes swept the room like a hawk surveying prey. "Listen up, candidates," Wells barked, her voice cutting through the morning chatter. "Welcome to 15 weeks of the most intensive training you've ever experienced. Half of you won't make it to graduation. The other half will wish you hadn't." She began calling names from her roster, assigning locker numbers, and explaining the daily schedule. When she reached Margaret's name, she paused, looking up from her clipboard. Chun Margaret, age 53. Her voice carried no judgment, just professional curiosity. Any medical conditions I need to know about? Heart problems? Joint issues, medications that might affect performance? No, Sergeant, Margaret replied firmly. Wells nodded and continued down the list, but Tyler couldn't let it go. Sergeant, with respect, shouldn't there be some kind of age limit? I mean, we're going to be depending on each other out there. If someone can't keep up physically... Wells fixed him with a stare that could have frozen coffee. Brennan, is it? Let me explain something to you. Everyone in this room passed the same entrance requirements. Everyone met the same standards. If Mrs. Chun is here, it's because she earned her spot just like you did. Your job isn't to question who belongs. Your job is to worry about whether you can meet the standards yourself. The morning progressed with equipment distribution and facility tours. Margaret moved through each station efficiently, asking practical questions about gear maintenance and protocol clarification. She didn't try to prove herself or engage with the subtle challenges from younger recruits. She simply existed in her space with a quiet confidence that seemed oddly out of place among the nervous energy of 20-somethings trying to project toughness they didn't yet possess. During the lunch break, the whispers continued. I give her 3 days before she quits, Tyler predicted, biting into his sandwich. The first time we do combat training, she's going to realize this isn't for her. I actually feel bad for her, Sarah admitted. Someone should have talked her out of this before she embarrassed herself. The academy isn't exactly known for going easy on people. Maybe she's having some kind of midlife crisis, Marcus suggested. You know, kids are grown, husband's retired. She's bored and thinks she wants to make a difference. Margaret sat alone at a corner table, methodically eating her salad while reviewing the training manual. She seemed completely unbothered by the speculation swirling around her, absorbed in memorizing radio codes and department procedures, with the focus of someone half her age cramming for finals. The afternoon brought their first taste of physical training. Sergeant Wells led them to the gymnasium, where various exercise stations were set up: pull-up bars, agility ladders, heavy bags, and mats for defensive tactics training. Today we establish baseline fitness levels, Wells announced. Don't try to be heroes. I need to know where you are so I can figure out where you need to be by graduation. The younger recruits attacked the exercises with enthusiasm, eager to demonstrate their capabilities. Tyler cranked out pull-ups with theatrical grunts, Sarah's marine training evident in her perfect form, Marcus pushing himself through burpees. With competitive intensity, Margaret approached each station methodically, performing the minimum required repetitions with efficient movements that wasted no energy. She didn't struggle, but she didn't showboat either. Her pull-ups were clean and controlled. Her push-ups maintained perfect form from first to last. Her mile run time was respectable for someone half her age. Not bad for a desk jockey, Tyler admitted grudgingly as they toweled off afterward. But wait until we start the real stuff. The real stuff, according to Wells, would begin tomorrow with defensive tactics training, the art of controlling suspects without getting hurt yourself. It was where academy dreams often died, where the gap between theory and reality became painfully clear. Tomorrow we learn how to survive when someone wants to hurt you, Wells told them as they prepared to leave. We'll see who has what it takes to protect others when they can barely protect themselves. As the recruits filed out, Margaret remained behind, helping stack the exercise mats with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown all day. Sergeant Wells watched her work, noting the way she moved: no wasted motion, no unnecessary effort, like someone who understood the value of conserving energy for when it mattered most. Long first day, Wells commented. Margaret straightened, meeting the sergeant's gaze. They always are. There was something in the way she said it, a weight that suggested she was referring to more than just police academy orientation. But before Wells could pursue the thought, Margaret had collected her things and headed for the exit, leaving only questions in her wake. Tomorrow will bring their first real test. Tomorrow they would learn whether Margaret Chun was a dreamer chasing an impossible goal, or something else entirely. The second day at Riverside Police Training Academy began at 5:30 in the morning with the piercing shriek of Sergeant Wells' whistle. Margaret was already dressed and standing at attention beside her bunk, when most of the other recruits were still fumbling for their alarm clocks. Her bed was made with military precision corners sharp enough to cut paper, blankets stretched taut without a single wrinkle. How is she already ready? Marcus groaned, stumbling past her toward the bathroom. It's like she doesn't need sleep. The dormitory buzzed with the chaos of 50 recruits trying to shower, dress, and grab breakfast in 30 minutes. Margaret moved through the morning routine with calm efficiency, helping a struggling recruit named David Park untangle his duty belt while simultaneously showing another how to properly align his badge placement. Her movements were economical, purposeful, never rushed despite the time pressure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During breakfast formation, Sergeant Wells announced the day's schedule, firearm safety, radio procedures, and their first defensive tactics session. The mention of defensive tactics sent a ripple of nervous energy through the group. This was what separated police training from civilian life learning to control people who didn't want to be controlled. Today you'll discover whether you have the instincts to protect yourself and others, Wells declared, her voice cutting through the morning air. Some of you will surprise yourselves. Others will realize this career isn't for them. Tyler nudged his breakfast companion, a recruit named Brandon Foster. $20 says the old lady taps out before lunch. I'm not taking that bet, Brandon whispered back. That's too easy. She'd probably hurt herself just trying to get down on the training mats. Margaret sat 3 tables away, methodically eating oatmeal while reviewing the defensive tactics manual. She'd borrowed a magnifying glass from the academy library, and several recruits had made jokes about her needing it to read the fine print. What they didn't notice was how quickly she absorbed the information, her finger tracing pressure point diagrams, and leverage techniques with the focus of someone studying for a doctoral defense. The morning's firearms safety course revealed more subtle contradictions. While other recruits struggled with proper grip and stance, Margaret's form was textbook perfect from the first moment she picked up the training weapon. Her questions weren't about basics, they were about situational applications and decision-making. Protocols. What's the department policy on drawing your weapon during a domestic disturbance call? She asked Instructor Davis, a 20-year veteran with patience worn thin by decades of rookie questions. Depends on the threat assessment, Davis replied, then looked at her more carefully. That's an advanced question for someone on day 2. I like to think ahead, Margaret said simply. During radio procedures training, she demonstrated an unusual familiarity with communication protocols. While other recruits stumbled over 10 codes and phonetic alphabets, Margaret's transmissions were crisp and professional. When asked where she'd learned proper radio etiquette, she mentioned volunteering for a local emergency services organization, a COT. Detail that explained some competence but raised new questions about why someone with that background would be starting from scratch in police training. Sarah Coleman, despite her initial skepticism, began to notice Margaret's quiet competence. You're really good at this stuff, she observed during a break between sessions. Are you sure you've never done law enforcement before? Margaret smiled that same patient smile. Different skills translate in unexpected ways. What kind of office work did you do exactly? Sarah pressed. Government administration, Margaret replied, which was technically true but revealed nothing meaningful. Lots of procedures to follow, attention to detail, working under pressure. The defensive tactics session took place in the academy's main training gym, where thick blue mats covered the floor and mirrors lined the walls. Instructor Kevin Nash, a compact man with calloused hands and the easy balance of someone who'd spent decades teaching people to fight, arranged the recruits in formation. "Defensive tactics isn't about winning fights," Nash began, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "It's about ending dangerous situations as quickly and safely as possible. Sometimes that means using force. Sometimes it means knowing when not to use force." He demonstrated basic stances and defensive positioning, then paired recruits off for practice. The younger recruits approached the training with a mixture of eagerness and apprehension. Tyler partnered with Brandon, both men trying to project confidence they didn't feel. Sarah worked with another female recruit, her Marine training evident in her aggressive but controlled movements. Margaret was paired with David Park, a soft-spoken computer science graduate who looked like a strong wind might knock him over. The pairing seemed logical to the instructors. Put the two least physically imposing recruits together, so neither would get hurt. "Don't worry about going easy on me," Margaret told David as they faced each other on the mat. "We're both here to learn." Nash walked them through basic defensive positions, how to stand, where to place their hands, how to create space between themselves and a potential threat. Margaret absorbed the instruction with focused attention, but her body seemed to already understand the concepts. Her stance was naturally balanced, her guard position instinctively correct. "Mrs. Chun," Nash observed, "you're picking this up quickly. Have you taken self-defense classes before?" "A few seminars over the years," she replied modestly. "Senior centers offer them sometimes." The explanation seemed plausible, but something about her movement pattern suggested more systematic training. When Nash demonstrated a basic escape technique from a wrist grab, Margaret's counter-movement was smooth and immediate, executed with precision that came from deep muscle memory rather than recent instruction. During partner practice, she worked with David at a controlled pace, helping him understand the leverage points and timing that made techniques effective. Her teaching was gentle but knowledgeable, breaking down complex movements into manageable steps. "Feel how your opponent's grip changes when you rotate your wrist this way," she guided David. "The thumb is always the weak point in any grab. Once you understand that, the escape becomes simple physics." Her explanation was more sophisticated than what Nash had provided, demonstrating an understanding of biomechanics that went beyond basic self-defense seminars. Several nearby pairs began listening to her quiet instruction, finding her explanations clearer than the official lesson plan. Tyler, wrestling with Brandon across the mat, glanced over with grudging curiosity. "How does she know so much about leverage points?" he muttered between attempts at a takedown. "Maybe those senior center classes are better than we thought," Brandon gasped, trying to escape Tyler's grip. As the session progressed, Margaret continued to demonstrate subtle competence that didn't quite fit her stated background. When Nash called for volunteers to demonstrate techniques in front of the class, she politely declined, but her helpful corrections to struggling classmates revealed knowledge that seemed oddly comprehensive. "The key to any control hold is understanding your opponent's balance," she explained to a group of recruits during a water break. "Once you can predict how they'll try to recover, you can stay one step ahead." "Where did you learn that?" asked Amy Richardson, a recruit who'd been struggling with the morning's lessons. "Experience teaches you to pay attention to details others miss," Margaret replied, which answered nothing while sounding perfectly reasonable. The session concluded with Nash assigning practice partners for tomorrow's advanced training. "We'll be covering weapons retention, multiple attacker scenarios, and ground fighting techniques," he announced. "These are the skills that keep officers alive when situations go wrong." Several recruits exchanged nervous glances. The training was becoming more serious, more realistic, more directly applicable to life or death situations they might face on the street. As they gathered their equipment, Margaret approached Nash quietly. "Instructor, I noticed some of the recruits are developing bad habits with their stance work. Would it be appropriate for me to offer some additional practice time this evening?" Nash studied her carefully. "You seem to have a good grasp of the fundamentals. Where did you say you learned this material?" Asterisk. "I've always been interested in understanding how things work," Margaret replied, deflecting the question with practiced ease. "Physical mechanics, leverage, problem solving under pressure. The principles are the same whether you're dealing with office politics or personal safety." It was another non-answer that sounded perfectly logical, delivered with the same patient smile that had become her trademark. Nash nodded approval for the evening practice session, but Margaret was already moving toward the exit, leaving him with the same nagging sense that there was more to her story than government, administration, and senior center seminars. The other recruits filed out discussing lunch plans and weekend leave, but several lingered to ask Margaret questions about technique refinements and theoretical applications. Without seeking attention or claiming expertise, she had somehow become the person others looked to for clarity and guidance. Tomorrow would bring more advanced training, more complex scenarios, more pressure to perform when stakes were higher. The recruits who had dismissed Margaret Chun as an optimistic dreamer were beginning to suspect there might be more to learn from the quiet woman with the patient smile and the mysteriously comprehensive knowledge of things she supposedly learned. At senior center seminars, asterisk, the third week of training arrived with unseasonable October heat that made the Academy's training facility feel like a furnace. Advanced defensive tactics had pushed every recruit to their limits, and the morning scenario-based training promised to be the most challenging yet. Sergeant Wells stood before the assembled class with the expression of someone about to separate wheat from chaff. "Today we test everything you've learned," she announced, gesturing toward a complex obstacle course that had been set up in the main gymnasium. Real-world scenarios, multiple threats, time pressure, decision-making under stress. The course included mock building layouts, cardboard cutout suspects, simulated weapon threats, and physical challenges that would test both tactical thinking and raw ability. More importantly, it would be observed by Captain Lawrence Torres, the Academy's commanding officer, who made final decisions about recruit advancement. Captain Torres was a legend in law enforcement circles, 32 years on the force, decorated veteran of the SWAT division, and the architect of modern police training protocols used across 3 states. His presence meant careers could be made or destroyed based on performance in the next hour. Tyler cracked his knuckles nervously. "This is it, real evaluation time." Sarah adjusted her gear with military precision. "Just remember your training. Stay calm, assess threats, respond appropriately." Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead despite the morning chill. "Easy for you to say you've done this kind of thing before." Margaret stood quietly at the back of the formation, checking her equipment with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. Her radio was properly positioned, her duty belt adjusted correctly, her posture alert but relaxed. She looked like someone waiting for a routine drill, rather than a career-defining evaluation. The first scenario began with Tyler entering a mock apartment layout. Hidden speakers played sounds of domestic disturbance, shouting voices, breaking glass, a woman's scream. He moved through the course competently but cautiously, his movements telegraphing uncertainty. When confronted with multiple cardboard suspects, he hesitated just long enough to fail the time requirement. "Brennan, you're thinking too much," Captain Torres called out. "In real situations, hesitation kills you and the people you're trying to protect." Sarah's run was textbook perfect, aggressive when needed, controlled throughout, decisive in her threat assessments. She completed the course in excellent time with no major errors. Marcus struggled with the physical demands but showed good tactical awareness. David Park froze completely when faced with a simulated armed suspect, and had to be talked through the scenario by instructors. Each recruit faced the course individually while others watched and learned from mistakes. The pattern was consistent: young, strong recruits who performed adequately, but showed the brittle confidence of people still learning to trust their training. Margaret's turn came last, after 47 other recruits had established the performance baseline. As she approached the starting line, she rolled her shoulders once, a small gesture that seemed oddly professional coming from someone who claimed to have learned self-defense at senior center seminars. Captain Torres checked his clipboard with mild interest. After watching nearly 50 runs, he was operating on autopilot, noting scores and deficiencies with mechanical precision. Margaret Chun, age 53, former government administrator. He expected competent but unremarkable performance. The scenario began with a simulated traffic stop gone wrong. Margaret approached the mock vehicle with perfect positioning, angled approach, hand on weapon but not drawn, verbal commands clear and authoritative. When the cardboard suspect suddenly produced a weapon, her response was instantaneous and flawless. She didn't think so. She reacted. Her weapon was drawn, aimed, and firing simulation rounds before the instructors running the scenario could fully deploy the threat. Her movement to cover was smooth and economical. Her radio call for backup was textbook perfect, even while engaging the target. Captain Torres looked up from his clipboard, suddenly paying attention. The scenario continued with Margaret advancing through the mock building layout. Each room presented new challenges, hostage situations, multiple suspects, environmental hazards. She navigated them with fluid precision that spoke of deep training and extensive experience. Her tactical movement was flawless. She sliced corners like a professional, maintained proper weapon orientation throughout, and made split-second decisions with absolute confidence. When faced with a scenario requiring non-lethal force, she transitioned from firearm to defensive tactics so smoothly it looked choreographed. The other recruits stopped their post-exercise discussions to watch. This wasn't the performance of someone learning new skills. This was someone demonstrating mastery. The final challenge involved multiple attackers in close-quarters combat. 3 instructors wearing protective gear played aggressive suspects, attempting to overwhelm her through sheer numbers and aggression. It was designed to be nearly impossible, a stress test that revealed how recruits performed when everything went wrong. Simultaneously, Margaret assessed the situation in the split second before engagement. Her positioning was perfect, creating angles that prevented the attackers from surrounding her. When the first instructor lunged forward, her response was devastating in its efficiency. She redirected his momentum with minimal effort, using his aggression against him while simultaneously creating distance from the other 2 attackers. Her counterstrike was precise, a controlled blow to a pressure point that dropped the instructor to his knees without causing injury. The second attacker moved to grapple her from behind. Margaret's escape was textbook perfect, but executed with speed that spoke of muscle memory developed over years of practice. She broke the hold, created separation, and transitioned to a controlling position in one fluid movement. The third instructor hesitated, suddenly aware that his 2 colleagues were on the ground and this 53-year-old recruit was barely breathing hard. Margaret used his momentary uncertainty to close distance and execute a perfect takedown that ended the scenario. Total time, 9.7 seconds. The gymnasium fell, absolutely silent. Captain Torres stared at his stopwatch, then looked at Margaret, then checked the stopwatch again. In 32 years of law enforcement and 15 years of running training scenarios, he had never seen anything like what had just happened. Sergeant Wells was the first to find her voice. "What the hell was that?" Margaret straightened her uniform and walked calmly toward the exit area. "Scenario complete, Captain." "Hold on just a minute," Torres called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just witnessed something That didn't fit any training manual. Mrs. Chun, where did you learn to do that? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Every recruit in the gymnasium was staring at Margaret, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of what they had just witnessed. Self-defense classes, she replied with the same patient smile she'd worn for 3 weeks. Self-defense classes, Torres repeated slowly, his tone making it clear he found that explanation inadequate. Ma'am, I've been doing this for over 30 years. I've trained Special Forces SWAT officers and federal agents. What you just demonstrated isn't something you learn at the local community center. Margaret met his gaze steadily, but didn't elaborate. Torres studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had too many missing pieces. There was something familiar about her technique, something that reminded him of training he'd received years ago from instructors who worked in classified environments. Class dismissed, he announced suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension. Everyone except Mrs. Chen. The other recruits filed out slowly, stealing glances at Margaret as they passed. Tyler shook his head in disbelief. Sarah looked at Margaret with new respect mixed with confusion. Marcus simply stared, trying to reconcile what he'd seen with 3 weeks of assumptions. As the gymnasium emptied, Captain Torres approached Margaret with the measured steps of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew. Mrs. Chun, he said quietly, I think we need to have a conversation about your background. Margaret stood at attention, her expression unchanged. What would you like to know, sir? Torres pulled out his phone and scrolled through a contact list that contained numbers most police officers would never see. I'm going to make a call. There are people who might be very interested to know that Margaret Chun is attending police academy training. For the first time in 3 weeks, Margaret's patient smile faltered. Captain, she said carefully, I'd prefer if you didn't do that. I'm sure you would, Torres replied, already dialing. But after what I just witnessed, I don't think this conversation is about what you prefer anymore. The phone rang once before a voice answered, a voice that belonged to someone who worked in places that didn't appear on government organizational charts. This is Captain Torres at Riverside Academy, he said into the phone, never taking his eyes off Margaret. I need you to run a name for me. Margaret Chun, age 53. I think she might be someone you used to know. The voice on Captain Torres' phone was crisp, professional, and carried the weight of federal authority. Hold the line, Captain. Don't let her leave the facility. Margaret's shoulders sagged slightly, not in defeat, but in the resignation of someone whose carefully constructed new life was about to unravel. She walked to the nearest bench and sat down, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain here while we sort this out, Torres said, ending the call. His tone had shifted from suspicion to something approaching respect mixed with caution. I understand, Margaret replied quietly. How long before they arrive? You know they're coming? Captain, after 30 years in law enforcement, you develop instincts about these things. And after what you just witnessed, you know I'm not who I claim to be. Torres pulled up a chair, studying her with new interest. 30 years? You said. You did government administration. Margaret looked up at him, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, her patient mask slipped away entirely. What Torres saw underneath was the steady gaze of someone who had made life and death decisions in circumstances he could barely imagine. I did government administration, Captain. I administered very specific government operations in very dangerous places where traditional law enforcement couldn't go. 25 minutes later, a black sedan pulled into the academy parking lot. 2 people emerged, a woman in her 50s wearing a tailored business suit and a man who moved with the controlled awareness of someone trained to expect trouble at any moment. Deputy Director Elena Rodriguez of the DEA's Special Operations Division had been Margaret's handler for the final 8 years of her career. Agent Michael Santos had been her backup on more operations than either of them cared to count. "Hello, Maggie," Rodriguez said as she entered the gymnasium using a name that Margaret hadn't heard in 12 years. "Elena, Michael." Margaret stood, embracing them with the warmth reserved for people who had trusted each other with their lives. "I was hoping this day wouldn't come." Captain Torres watched the reunion with growing understanding. "So Margaret, Chun isn't your real name." "Margaret Chin is my real name," she replied. "But for 28 years, I was Special Agent Margaret Chun, Deep Cover Operations Division, Drug Enforcement Administration." Rodriguez opened a thick file folder marked with classification levels that Torres recognized but had never been cleared to read. "Captain, what I'm about to share with you is classified at the highest levels. Agent Chun's service record is sealed for national security reasons. But given what you've witnessed today, you need to understand who you've been training." She spread photographs across a nearby table, surveillance images from operations in Colombia, Mexico, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe. In each photo, Margaret was barely recognizable. Different hair, different clothes, different identities, but always the same focused expression of someone operating in environments where a single mistake meant death. Agent Chun specialized in long-term infiltration of international drug cartels. Rodriguez continued. Her cover identities lasted months or years. She lived as an accountant for money laundering operations, a logistics coordinator for trafficking networks, a translator for high-level negotiations between criminal organizations. Santos picked up the narrative. What made her exceptional wasn't just her ability to maintain cover, it was her tactical capabilities when those covers were blown. Maggie operated alone, often hundreds of miles from backup, in situations where extraction wasn't possible. Torres studied the photographs, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. The defensive tactic skills. When you're surrounded by armed cartel members who just discovered you're a federal agent, community center self-defense classes don't keep you alive, Margaret said simply. I was trained by the best tactical instructors in multiple agencies: FBI hostage rescue team, Navy SEAL close quarters combat specialists, agency operatives whose names you'll never know. Rodriguez pulled out another photograph, a group shot of 12 agents in tactical gear. This was taken after Operation Serpent, our most successful cartel infiltration. Margaret spent 18 months undercover with the Morales organization, documenting their entire North American distribution network. How did it end? Torres asked, though something in the way Margaret's expression changed told him the answer wouldn't be pleasant. The same way most of them ended, Santos replied grimly. Someone talked. Our cover was blown during a routine meeting that turned into an ambush. 12 agents went in for extraction. 4 came out. Margaret's voice was steady but carried years of accumulated grief. I was liaison with local law enforcement for that operation. The intelligence we received about the meeting location was wrong, deliberately wrong. Someone in the Colombian National Police was feeding information to the cartel. 8 agents died because of compromised intelligence, Rodriguez added. Margaret fought her way out through 16 armed cartel members and carried 2 wounded agents to safety across 12 miles of hostile territory. Torres examined another photograph, Margaret in a hospital bed, her face barely recognizable under bandages and bruises. This was after that extraction? That was after I decided I couldn't do it anymore, Margaret replied. I'd lost too many partners, seeing too many good agents die because of intelligence failures and political complications beyond our control. After 28 years, I realized I was more valuable to law enforcement training the next generation than I was getting people killed in operations I couldn't control. Santos opened his laptop and pulled up classified files. Her operational record speaks for itself. 47 successful long-term infiltrations, over 200 major arrests, seizure of assets totaling $800 million. Disruption. of drug trafficking networks across 4 continents. She was offered the Medal of Valor 3 times, Rodriguez added. Turned it down each time because accepting public recognition would have compromised her ability to work undercover. Captain Torres sat back in his chair, reassessing everything he thought he knew about police training, and the woman who had been quietly helping struggling recruits for 3 weeks. "Why didn't you just apply for an instructor position?" he asked. "With your background, any law enforcement agency would have hired you immediately." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Because instructors have to explain why they know what they know. They have to share war stories and operational details that I spent 3 decades learning to keep secret. And because every time I see young officers making mistakes, I remember my partners who died because someone else made similar mistakes. "So you decided to start over as a recruit?" "I decided to learn how regular police work from the ground up. Street patrol, community policing, standard protocols, all the aspects of law enforcement that I never experienced because I spent my career in specialized operations. I wanted to understand how to keep ordinary officers safe in ordinary situations." Rodriguez closed the file folder. "Captain, Agent Chun's psychological evaluations consistently noted her exceptional ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, her tactical improvisation skills, and her protective instincts toward team members. What you witnessed today was someone with 28 years of survival training operating at about 10% of her actual capability." 10%? Torres repeated. "Captain, with respect," Santos said. "What you saw was Margaret being careful not to hurt your instructors. If she had treated that scenario as an actual threat, all 3 of them would have required medical attention." Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at recruits practicing formation drills. "For 12 years, I've lived quietly in a small town, working part-time jobs, trying to be normal. But I couldn't stop thinking about young officers dying because they didn't know things that I learned the hard way. So I decided to do something about it. By starting from scratch as a 53-year-old recruit," she turned back to face them. "By learning how to teach without explaining where the knowledge comes from. By understanding what modern police training covers and what it misses. By figuring out how to prepare officers for real-world situations without traumatizing them with stories they don't need to hear." Rodriguez and Santos exchanged glances, a wordless conversation between people who had worked together for decades. "Maggie," Rodriguez said finally, "there might be another way to accomplish what you're trying to do." "Elena, I'm not going back to operations." "Not operations, training. The Academy has been developing a new instructor program for high-risk, tactical situations. Someone with your background could design curricula that bridges the gap between standard training and reality-based preparation." Margaret looked at Captain Torres. "What would that mean for the other recruits?" "It would mean," Torres said slowly, "that they'd have the benefit of learning from someone whose experience extends far beyond anything we can currently teach them. And it would mean," Santos added, "that instead of hiding your knowledge and helping one recruit class at a time, you could influence how officers are trained for the next 20 years. Margaret was quiet for several minutes, considering possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. "There would be conditions," she finally said. "No publicity, no interviews, no public recognition. My operational history remains classified. And I train officers to survive and protect others, not to be warriors." Captain Torres extended his hand. "Agent Chun, would you be interested in discussing a position as senior tactical instructor?" "For the first time in 12 years, Margaret." Chun smiled with the confidence of someone who had found her true mission. "Captain, I think we have a lot to discuss. The transformation at Riverside Police Training Academy didn't happen overnight, but it was unmistakable. Within a week of Margaret's new role as senior tactical instructor, the entire atmosphere had shifted. Word had spread, not the classified details, but the essential truth that the quiet woman they'd dismissed was someone extraordinary. Margaret's first official class was scheduled for the following Monday. As she prepared her lesson plan in the empty gymnasium, recruits began appearing at the doors. Not for assigned training, but out of curiosity and something approaching awe. Tyler Brennan was the first to approach, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you several apologies." Margaret looked up from the tactical diagram she was arranging. "Tyler, you treated me exactly how most people would treat someone they didn't understand. There's nothing to apologize for." "There's everything to apologize for," he insisted. "You were helping us helping me, and I was too stupid and proud to see it." Sarah Coleman joined them, her military bearing evident as she stood at attention. "Ma'am, permission to speak freely?" Margaret smiled at the formal approach. "We're not in the military, Sarah. Just talk to me." That 10-second demonstration was that really you holding back? "Considerably," Margaret replied without boasting. "Real threats require different responses. What you saw was careful training methodology, not survival tactics." Over the next few days, Margaret's informal evening sessions evolved into something unprecedented in academy training. Recruits who had struggled with basic defensive tactics were now asking sophisticated questions about threat assessment and psychological preparation for high-stress encounters. "How do you stay calm when everything is going wrong?" asked David Park, the computer science graduate who had frozen during his first scenario test. Margaret set up a training scenario on the spot. "Panic happens when you focus on what you can't control. Let me show you what I mean." She blindfolded David and had other recruits create noise distractions around him while giving him a simple task to complete. At first he struggled, overwhelmed by sensory input. Then Margaret began talking to him through focusing techniques, breathing patterns, priority assessment, mental compartmentalization. "Feel your feet on the ground," she guided. "That's your foundation. Everything else is just information, not threats. Process what you need, ignore what you don't." By the third attempt, David was completing complex tasks despite chaotic distractions. More importantly, he was understanding principles that would serve him throughout his career. Marcus Rodriguez approached Margaret after observing the exercise. "Ma'am, that technique, is that something they teach in standard police training?" "It should be," Margaret replied. "Most officers never learn to manage sensory overload until they experience it in life-threatening situations. By then, it's too late to develop those skills safely." Her formal classes began incorporating elements that weren't found in any standard curriculum. She taught micro-expression reading for detecting deception and assessing genuine threats. She demonstrated environmental awareness techniques that allowed officers to identify potential ambush situations before walking into them. Most significantly, she shared decision-making frameworks that helped officers think clearly under pressure. Captain Torres observed one of her classes from the back of the room. Margaret was teaching a lesson on presence and de-escalation skills that prevented situations from requiring force in the first place. Your voice, your posture, your eye contact, these communicate more than your badge or your weapon, she explained to the assembled recruits. Most people comply with lawful authority when that authority is presented with quiet confidence rather than aggressive dominance. She paired recruits for role-playing exercises, but these weren't the standard scenarios from training manuals. These were drawn from real situations she had navigated during undercover operation situations where blending authority with approachability had meant the difference between successful missions and violent confrontations. "Tyler, you're approaching a domestic disturbance call. Sarah, you're the upset resident. The goal isn't to control the situation through force. It's to create an environment where people choose to cooperate." Tyler's first attempt was a textbook but mechanical. His commands were correct, but delivered with the rigid authority that often escalated rather than resolved conflicts. Sarah responded with the defensive hostility that officers encountered daily on the street. "Stop," Margaret interrupted. "Tyler, what did you notice about Sarah's body language when you approached?" "She was resistant, defensive." "Why?" Tyler considered the question. "Because I came across as threatening." "You came across as someone who had already decided she was the problem. Try again, but this time approach her as someone who might be able to help solve a problem rather than someone who needs to be controlled." The difference in the second attempt was remarkable. Tyler's demeanor shifted from authoritative to professional but approachable. Sarah's defensive posture relaxed. The conversation moved from confrontation to collaboration. "That," Margaret said to the class, "is how you create compliance instead of demanding it." The ripple effects extended beyond individual skill development. Recruits began studying together differently, sharing insights rather than competing for top rankings. The evening training sessions became collaborative workshops where everyone contributed to everyone else's improvement. Amy Richardson, who had struggled with physical aspects of training, found herself excelling at the psychological and tactical elements Margaret emphasized. "I always thought police work was about being tough enough to fight anyone," she told Margaret after a particularly successful scenario exercise. "But you're teaching us to be smart enough that we don't have to fight." "Violence should always be the last option, not the first," Margaret replied. "Not because violence is wrong when necessary, but because unnecessary violence usually means someone made poor decisions earlier in the encounter." The most significant transformation was in how recruits viewed their future role in law enforcement. Margaret's lessons consistently emphasized protection and service over enforcement and control. Her operational stories, carefully sanitized if classified, details illustrated how good officers prevent problems rather than just responding to them. During one undercover operation, she shared during a lesson on community policing principles, "I spent 6 months working in a neighborhood with serious drug trafficking problems. The most valuable intelligence I gathered didn't come from surveillance or informants. It came from building genuine relationships with people who lived there, people who wanted their community to be safe but didn't trust law enforcement." She described how understanding community dynamics, showing respect for residents regardless of their circumstances, and consistently following through on commitments had eventually led to cooperation that broke up major trafficking networks. "The lesson isn't about undercover work," she concluded. "It's about remembering that effective policing requires community trust, and community trust requires officers who see themselves as guardians rather than occupiers." 3 weeks into Margaret's tenure as instructor, Captain Torres received a visit from the State Police Training Commissioner, who had heard rumors about unconventional teaching methods at Riverside Academy. "Captain, I understand you have a new instructor who's implementing some unusual training protocols." Torres led the commissioner to observe one of Margaret's classes. She was teaching a lesson called Reading the Room, how to assess multiple people simultaneously for threat indicators, deception signs, and cooperative potential. "Most situations involve multiple people with different agendas," Margaret was explaining. "Your job is to quickly identify who might help, who might hinder, and who might pose genuine threats. Watch people's eyes, their hand positions, how they position themselves relative to exits and to each other." She set up a complex scenario involving 6 recruits playing different roles: cooperative witness, hostile bystander, potential threat, frightened victim, and 2 unknowns. A 7th recruit had to enter the situation and rapidly assess everyone's role and motivation. The exercise was sophisticated, realistic, and taught skills that typically took years of street experience to develop. "Where did she learn to teach like this?" the commissioner asked Torres quietly. "Extensive field experience," Torres replied, which was true while revealing nothing classified. "She brings a level of practical knowledge that you can't get from textbooks." Asterisk, the commissioner observed several more exercises, noting how Margaret's teaching consistently emphasized judgment, restraint, and protection of all parties involved in police encounters. Captain, I'd like to discuss incorporating some of these methods into our statewide training standards. That evening, Margaret found a message from Deputy Director Rodriguez asking her to call immediately. Maggie, we're getting inquiries from multiple agencies about your training methods. Word is spreading in law enforcement circles about some kind of revolutionary approach to officer preparation. Asterisk, Elena, I'm just teaching basic survival and decision-making skills. Basic to you, maybe. But apparently you're producing recruits who think and react differently than traditional training creates. We're getting requests to study your methods for potential implementation in federal training programs. Margaret sat quietly, considering the implications. Her goal had been to help one class of recruits become better officers. Instead, she had apparently stumbled onto something that could influence how law enforcement was taught throughout the country. What are you thinking? Rodriguez asked. I'm thinking, Margaret replied, that maybe the best way to honor the partners I lost is to make sure the next generation of officers is prepared for realities that textbooks can't teach them. So you're interested in expanding this program? Margaret looked around the empty academy gymnasium, imagining classrooms full of young officers, learning skills that might keep them alive and help them serve their communities more effectively. Elena, I think we need to have a much bigger conversation about what police training could become. 2 years later, Officer Tyler Brennan stood outside a rundown apartment building in downtown Phoenix, his radio crackling with reports of a domestic disturbance involving weapons. His partner, a veteran officer named Detective Walsh, was assessing the situation with the kind of rushed urgency that Margaret Sheen had taught Tyler to avoid. We go in hard and fast, Walsh decided. Separate the parties, control the scene. Sort it out afterward. Tyler held up a hand, his voice calm but firm. Detective, give me 2 minutes to read the situation first. He approached the building using techniques Margaret had taught him: environmental awareness, sound analysis, body language observation of neighbors watching from windows. What he saw told a story different from the emergency call. The woman who called this in is standing by her car across the street, Tyler noted. She's not running away or seeking cover. The neighbors in the windows look concerned but not terrified. And listen, do you hear actual fighting, or do you hear someone having a breakdown? Walsh paused, really listening for the first time. The sounds from the apartment were anguished but not violent sobbing. Pleas for help, but no impacts or struggles. What are you thinking? Walsh asked. I'm thinking we have someone in crisis who needs help, not someone who needs to be controlled. They entered the building with weapons holstered, moving carefully but non-threateningly. Inside the apartment, they found a young father holding his infant daughter, surrounded by overturned furniture and empty alcohol bottles. His wife sat in the corner, phone in hand, tears streaming down her face. Sir, I'm Officer Brennan. Can you tell me what's happening here? What followed was 15 minutes of careful de-escalation that transformed a potential arrest situation into a referral to family services and substance abuse counseling. No weapons were drawn, no one was handcuffed, and a family in crisis got the help they needed rather than additional trauma. Where did you learn to handle situations like that? Walsh asked as they completed their paperwork. From someone who taught me that most problems can be solved by understanding people instead of overpowering them. Similar scenes were playing out across the country. Margaret's first class of recruits had graduated and spread throughout law enforcement agencies, carrying with them approaches to policing that emphasized protection, service, and community. Trust over enforcement and control. Officer Sarah Coleman, now working gang intervention in Los Angeles, had adapted Margaret's undercover relationship-building techniques to develop genuine connections with at-risk youth. Her arrest rates were lower than her colleagues, But her success rate in steering young people away from criminal activity was unprecedented. "You can't arrest your way out of social problems," she explained to newer officers during training sessions, "but you can build relationships that prevent problems from becoming crimes." David Park, the former computer science student who had once frozen during training scenarios, was now a detective specializing in cybercrimes. Margaret's lessons about staying calm under pressure and compartmentalizing complex information had made him exceptionally effective at tracking sophisticated online criminal networks. The technique she taught us about processing multiple information streams simultaneously, he told a national law enforcement technology conference. "Those skills translate directly to digital investigation work. You learn to see patterns in chaos." Margaret's influence extended far beyond her original recruits. The training methods she had developed at Riverside Academy were now being studied and implemented at police academies in 17 states. The National Police Training Institute had created the Chun Protocol, a comprehensive approach to officer preparation that emphasized psychological resilience, community engagement, and tactical flexibility. But the most significant change wasn't in training curricula or department policies. It was in how individual officers thought about their role in society. Marcus Rodriguez, now a sergeant in Denver, described the difference to his shift briefing. "We used to train officers to be warriors going into battle. Now we train guardians who understand that their job is to protect everyone in their community, including the people they arrest." The ripple effects reached into communities that had historically distrusted law enforcement. Crime rates in neighborhoods served by Margaret's former students showed consistent decreases, but more importantly, community cooperation with police increased dramatically. "These officers are different," explained Maria Santos, a community organizer in East Cleveland who had worked with several of Margaret's graduates. "They don't come into our neighborhood looking for trouble to stop. They come looking for ways to help people solve problems before those problems become trouble." Margaret herself had become something she never sought to be, a nationally recognized expert in law enforcement training, despite maintaining her preference for working behind the scenes. She declined media interviews and speaking engagements, but her influence was felt through the hundreds of officers she had trained directly and the thousands who learned from curricula she had developed. Captain Torres, now promoted to deputy chief of training for the state police, often reflected on the day Margaret had disarmed 3 instructors in under 10 seconds. "We thought we were watching someone demonstrate fighting skills," he told a conference of police administrators. "What we were actually seeing was someone who had spent decades learning how to protect people, including people who were trying to hurt her." Asterisk. The transformation extended beyond policing into other fields where people were underestimated because of age, appearance, or background. Margaret's story became a quiet legend in professional circles, proof that expertise often wore unexpected disguises and that the most valuable people in any organization might be the ones everyone overlooked. At a healthcare conference, Dr. Jennifer Liu, a former emergency room nurse who had returned to medical school at age 48, referenced Margaret's example while discussing age discrimination in medicine. "Competence doesn't have an expiration date. Experience doesn't become worthless when your hair turns gray. Sometimes the person who knows the most is the one everyone assumes knows the least." Asterisk. In corporate boardrooms, executives began paying attention to overlooked employees who had been quietly solving problems for years without seeking recognition. The Margaret Chun principle became shorthand for looking beyond surface assumptions to find hidden value in unexpected places. Margaret's evening classes at the academy continued, now attended by officers from multiple agencies who wanted to learn advanced tactical thinking and community engagement techniques. These sessions had evolved into something unprecedented, a place where law enforcement professionals of all experience levels came to learn from each other. Asterisk. The most important lesson isn't about tactics or techniques, Margaret told a group of veteran detectives during one of these sessions. It's about remembering that every person you encounter is someone's child, parent, sibling, or friend. They have stories, struggles, and reasons for their actions. Your job is to resolve situations in ways that honor everyone's humanity, including your own. One evening, as Margaret was organizing training materials after a particularly intensive session, she found a handwritten note left on her desk. Asterisk. Man, you probably don't remember me, but I was one of the recruits who thought you didn't belong. Here, you changed how I see everything about this job. More importantly, you changed how I see people I used to overlook. My daughter is 7 years old, and when she's old enough to understand, I'm going to tell her that the most important person I ever met was someone everyone thought didn't matter. Thank you for teaching us that heroes don't always look like what we expect. Officer to Brennan. Margaret smiled, thinking about all the young officers who were now protecting communities with skills and perspectives they had learned from someone they initially dismissed. She thought about her lost partners, whose deaths had driven her to seek a different way to serve, and realized they would be proud of what their sacrifice had ultimately created. As she turned off the lights and prepared to leave the academy, Margaret reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from federal agent to maintenance worker to instructor to catalyst for nationwide change in law enforcement training. She had started with a simple goal: keep young officers alive by sharing knowledge gained through decades of dangerous work. What she had accomplished was far greater. She had influenced an entire profession to think differently about service, protection, and the value of understanding people rather than simply controlling them. The recruits who had once mocked her age now carried her lessons to communities across the country, creating safer environments not through force but through wisdom, not through dominance but through genuine care for the people they served. Margaret Chun had proven that true strength wasn't measured in speed of reflexes or force of impact. It was measured in the ability to change hearts, minds, and systems in ways that protected everyone. Sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons, but with patience, not through recognition, but through service, not by being seen, but by ensuring others can see clearly when it matters most. And sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones everyone underestimates until the moment they need them most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.